Okay. Welcome back, everyone. We're going to give folks some time to trickle in as I introduce our next session. This is Tag Along with Adler, and your presenter is Jessica BrodeFrank. As Beth Madison listed in the comments, please keep yourself muted unless speaking. Please refrain from sharing your screen if you're not the presenter. And if you have any questions throughout the presentation, you can drop them directly in the chat and we will be looking for them. All right, take it away.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jessica BrodeFrank. I am currently a doctoral researcher at the University of London. And in this talk, I want to explore the modern opportunities that online crowdsourcing can provide cultural heritage institutions, specifically museums, and how in particular metadata tagging projects offer institutions the opportunity to connect collections to the public wherever the public may be. So I really want to dive into the conversation of who gets to do the describing and then who is then privileged to discover collections. Let's see if I can get that to advance. Okay. Sorry, it's 9 a.m. in LA, so I'm still a little bit behind, but here we go. So the searchability, usability, and findability of collections is impacted by the professional descriptive language created by catalogers that exist as part of the collection's metadata. So working towards access for all requires a semantic shift from describing an object's physicality to describing an object's context. A particularly adept way to make this shift is to bring the public into the description process, engaging them with pieces and expanding catalog data that is more representative to the public as a whole while engaging them in a mission-centric experience. Over the last 50 years, the museum field experienced a technological boom, one that most of us have been a part of. Access to collections expanded online, and that online access to collections evolved. It took our searchable catalogs from the back-end realm of catalogers to the museum's front-facing website. Many of these sites rely on search functionality reminiscent to a Google platform. But this actually disenfranchises our guests and users who do not know the language by which to query a collection in a search bar as seen above. Even with bracketed browse capabilities, as shown on the Smithsonian site in the lower corner, the terms used often focus on physicality of objects and not the deeper thematic narratives that guests are often looking for. And access to collections has moved from museum websites to social media platforms. This lack of describing objects' context has also created access limitations internally for staff. As museums participate in social media trends and collaborative hashtags, the majority of these have revolved around what information is depicted within the context of an object, more than their actual physicality. So things like sunshine, flowers, and even cake were trending museum hashtags in the last 3 years. But if those terms are not in the actual catalog metadata, museum workers actually need to scour images within the databases to find what is not being returned in searches. This often becomes problematic during diversity initiatives like Pride Month or Black History Month, when museum staff even struggle to find relevant collections due to lack of contextual metadata. Unlike text-based forms of information, cultural heritage objects and their images have not traditionally been described according to subject matter or the context. Descriptions often focus on things like who made the piece, what it's made of, what size it is, when it was made, where it was made. These are all the physicality. And though it's useful information, the information does not help when a person is querying a database looking for images that feature a specific visual element like sunshine or thematic elements like Black history. My research focused on the possibilities of bringing crowdsourcing into this process. Crowdsourcing in museums has proven over the last 2 decades to be a way to not only increase access points to collections and enrich data, but it also promises to take this long obfuscated backend process, our metadata creation, and make it more transparent, turning it into a mission-centric engaging activity with the public. So I'd like to digress for a short introduction to crowdsourcing for those who are new to the concept. Crowdsourcing has its origins in business. It began as a way to simply outsource labor to the crowd. Whether or not we involve financial incentivization in the process, in the most basic sense, most cultural heritage and even citizen science-based projects are still, at least in part, thinking of crowdsourcing as a way of distributing work for efficiency. Instead of one person completing a specific task many times, a large number of people work on that same task fewer times, but are able to collectively produce the same result. I like to use the definition of crowdsourcing put forward by Mia Ridge, Megan Ferreter, and Samantha Blicken, who as leads for the Collective Wisdom Project that was published in 2022, stated a more specific definition of crowdsourcing in cultural heritage. Their definition was, quote, a form of digitally enabled participation that promises deeper, more engaged relationships with the public via meaningful tasks with cultural heritage collections, end quote. Today, when we think of crowdsourcing as a means to support research or archival work, we are more often divorced from crowdsourcing's original business model. We're no longer paying volunteers for their labor, we're working with volunteers, which is significantly different and requires its own ethical consideration. So in the interest of time, I've included a slide to the chapter from the Collective Wisdom Handbook that actually dives deeper into the idea of ethics for crowdsourcing. But as mentioned, metadata crowdsourcing has been tested and piloted in museums in some form for the last 15 years. In the mid-2000s, work with the Steve Museum was envisioned most in line with the goals of outsourcing cataloging work, but it yielded early results for diversification of language and expansion of discoverability. And in the 2010s, the Your Painting project out of the UK expanded on the semantic gap between what the public and catalogers use and began looking at the act of crowdsourcing as a possible expansion of museum engagement work. My research picks up on the work of dozens of projects conducted to show various advantages of crowdsourcing, but also includes the ability to create this transparent process that exposes not only the choices made by museum catalogers, but also the algorithms that underscore the searches throughout our users' experiences online. My research looks to reframe crowdsourcing projects and metadata projects in particular within museums from the traditional ideas of outsourcing labor and into participatory experiences. In the summer of 2020, I began designing the Zooniverse hosted project that I will play a little video of right here. It's called Tag Along with Adler. It launched in March of 2021 on Zooniverse, and it ran for a year. It was a metadata tagging project that looked to bring volunteer-generated metadata tags and terms into the Adler's cataloging system to improve searchability and findability of collections online, while also diversifying the language that's included. The tag-along project was not designed around a single collection or a single output goal, as is typical for most Zooniverse projects, but instead around changing the way collections are cataloged and whose voice is included. At the beginning of the project, every term searchable in the Adler's collection database for the 1,000 objects included in the project were collected to develop an institutional vocabulary that could be compared to that of a folksonomy or the user-generated taxonomy created during the project. The project's about text, help text, and field guide were all designed to clearly state that the goal is to compile volunteer tags. Therefore, there are no wrong answers, as this differs from traditional crowdsourcing and citizen science projects on Zooniverse that often want a consensus. I actually decided to include AI tags in this project specifically to reflect emerging projects in the sector within the last 5 years. Several museums, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Barnes Foundation, MIT, and Harvard Art Museums, have employed machine vision to analyze, categorize, and interpret their collections' images. And although the application of AI to museums is still in its infancy, the results being reported showed promise in line with outsourcing catalog work. AI already underpins many routine aspects of our lives, and part of the inclusion of the AI tags in this project was to actually raise with project participants the ways in which these tags are instrumental to their daily search and discovery tasks, often in ways they do not actually realize. Reviewing the literature, it's evident that machine vision and AI tagging have become advanced enough to detect subject matter and objects depicted across various content types, including the paintings, photographs, and rare book illustrations that were included in this project. They have been used by various institutions already to enrich existing metadata. However, not only are these AI models limited in their ability to process complexity, but they are still trained by humans based on the cataloging practices of museums. Therefore, they often create exemplary tags for religious, Christian, or Westernized canonical images, but there's complications for other. The importance here is to recognize that by switching to a machine, the bias and semantic gap are not removed from the cataloging, but they're actually seemingly trained into the AI. In the example shown here, the AI taggers added terms for scientists and doctors to the images on the left, but they continued to tag nurses for the images on the right. The inclusion of AI tags was done to expose project participants to this emerging technology, both its positives and its negatives, but also to gauge various questions on user motivations. It was not done to replace the human tagging component. Because a noted purpose of the research on crowdsourcing metadata projects was to enhance and expand accessibility and representation of cataloging data, ensuring that a representative public as a part of the project is vital. The only demographic information on the audience and users of this case study were collected through voluntary self-selected surveys. I decided to go with voluntarily provided and make it not a requirement to participate in the project, as it can be a barrier to entry for those who do not feel comfortable identifying various aspects of their identity, especially within institutions where they already may feel tokenized, othered, or excluded. Approximately 5% of project participants participated in this survey. And here you'll see charts with the demographic information requested and self-submitted by volunteers. The question centered around education level, ethnicity, gender, and age. This data comes with limitations, of course, as only 5% of users opted into participating, but it does help to provide a baseline for the effectiveness of claiming that project data is a more representational voice than professional museum staff could produce on their own. As one of the purposes of this project is to provide more representational access points to the Adler, it's helpful to note these demographics and these surveys come with margins of errors and issues with sample size. However, they did provide a baseline knowledge for who was participating. Here you'll see that 66% of project participants identified as white, whereas the Art Museum Directors survey indicated approximately 84% of staff working on collections context are white. The optional survey that was shared with participants to gauge demographic information was also used to provide qualitative baselines on engagement, not just engagement of users with the project itself, but also these learning objectives of the project. The data was essential when discussing crowdsourcing projects as a mission-centric participatory experience. One set of questions asked in a survey was particularly helpful in gauging audience perspectives on things like trust and representation. Approximately 1/3 of survey respondents agreed that they felt stories like theirs were included in museum collections, and similarly, 1/3 responded they felt stories like theirs were included in exhibitions. Combining that with the extremely high markers that participants felt museums were essential to communities at about 96%, and that communities were essential to museums at 97%, there is a marked opportunity for museums to leverage their place within the community to begin participatory experiences that would bring the public into the process of description, helping to increase the representation that is notably lacking for approximately 2/3 of volunteers. The Americans' Motivations for and Barriers to Engaging Science report that was published in May of 2022 supports the results I saw in my own survey. It specifically looked to determine barriers to engagement among African and Hispanic adults in America, where there is a marked response of feeling disconnected and underrepresented in cultural spaces for these two groups. Of particular note in my own survey is the disagreement rate to the question, I trust museums reflect multiple perspectives. Whereas the response shows a small minority selecting disagree or strongly disagree at about 7 to 8%, when you break it down by race, it is clear that those who do not prefer to indicate their race actually disagreed at a markedly higher rate of 20%. Those who indicated their race as Black or African disagreed at 25%. And similarly, those of Hispanic and Latinx did not have any disagreement, but with only a 60% majority selecting a neutral stance, their agreement rate of only 40% is furthest from the group average response of 68%. This indicates a difference in museum experiences and trust for minority groups, particularly the African American and Hispanic American backgrounds. The white Caucasian response aligned closest to the average group you saw before, indicating the value of breaking down these responses by the race. By breaking down the following qualitative responses by demographic, it again showed that Black, African, and Hispanic Latinx, as well as in this case, Asian respondents, did not feel that collections and expositions represented their stories in the same way that the white Caucasian audiences do. An important piece is not only demonstrated in this case study result, but it's also confirmed in a 2022 report by the Association of Science and Technology Centers, which showed that African American and Hispanic guests reported increased barriers to entry in science centers and museums, with 40% of African American participants and 33% of Hispanic participants noting that the exhibits were too white-centric. The data so far has been really useful in discussing user behavior and limitations. However, it's also possible to use the data to demonstrate that the semantic gap does in fact exist. As discussed earlier, a full survey of the Adler cataloging data was conducted as part of the project build. And this was done in part to create that baseline of what the Adler's actual cataloging data looks like and what terms permeate that data. As shown on the left, the most frequent terms across Adler records were locations of objects, where they were created, where books were published, item types, years of creation, as well as significant makers like object makers and authors. Though this data is clearly important for provenance and understanding of the objects in the collection, it does not represent much about the context of our objects. In comparison, on the right, the frequency of terms created by users of the tag-along project can be seen. And these terms lack those kind of physicality markers of location and dates, and instead demonstrate a language geared toward describing what an object is about. Most importantly, it's really looking at just these 30 tags will show a gap in the way that museums catalog collections versus the way the public describes and looks to use these collections. Another way to visualize that importance for user language can be added to the catalog is demonstrated here. Each image shows a photograph from the Adler's archival collection, with the left including the terms that are already included in the Adler catalog and the right including the terms that were added as part of the Tag Along with Adler project. Not only do these images help to demonstrate a difference in how museum catalogers describe images at a collection level versus actual image content level, but it also shows the amount of access points that can be added through crowdsourcing projects, again, increasing discoverability. Additionally, our qualitative survey questions on experience help to show that volunteers overwhelmingly found the case studies to be engaging, thought-provoking, and fun. When taking these qualitative statements and statistics in tandem with the quantitative statistics that demonstrate the ability of these projects to enrich collections and cross the semantic gap between catalogers and the public, these projects prove to be valuable and integral in a piece of digital engagement programming for the future. An important implication of this research was on the breadth of accessibility that crowdsourcing metadata projects can bring to institutional collections, not just in expanding diverse narrative and access points through metadata tags, but also expanding access to collections images through the creation and enrichment of image descriptions and alt text online. As cultural heritage institutions look towards diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion work, it is imperative that this work includes steps to make our digital resources more accessible online. As a crucial step to this is making digital resources, in particular digital images, accessible online, is the inclusion of alt text and long descriptions. Alt text or alternative text is the textual substitute for non-textual content on web pages. And importantly, for the implications of this research, alt text should not simply repeat caption information or cataloging information. Instead, it should describe the context of the image. It should describe what sighted visitors would see when they look at the image themselves. An interesting development within my own research was the continual inclusion of metadata tags added in full sentence structures, describing the images seen within the project. Within the tags added for the project, on average, across the 11 incremental data releases, about 5% of tag submissions were done in these full syntax styles. Full sentence descriptions were added by volunteers unprompted by the project team. It is a truth in itself that alt text requires significant labor, and it is a noted truth about cataloging as well. The implications of this specific research show the potential for crowdsourcing in describing the context of images within cultural heritage institutions. And I would argue that this description can be used for both the expansion of cultural heritage institution search, but also the creation of alternative texts. Organizations can say that they can't afford to do something, but that often means that they don't value it. Pleading poverty as a reason to avoid producing alt text runs counter to the legal and moral imperative to remove barriers, as stated by Emily Watlington. Viewing crowdsourcing projects as engaging experiences with institutions, publics, and sources for diverse and representational contextual descriptions, it is possible to allocate the labor and the time needed to make a project successful. leading to the creation of cataloging language and alternative text. Additionally, as technologies that cultural heritage institutions utilize to provide access to their collections innovate, including virtual catalogs and embedded metadata, so too must our processes along the way. And that ends my presentation. And we can dive into questions.
All right, as Ashley noted in the chat, feel free to drop them in, starting with the queue, and just let us know if you prefer to ask Jessica like verbally and unmute rather than do this via chat if it's easier for you. We'll just give everybody a couple of seconds to formulate a sort of questions.
So I saw a question come through. Did we have any issue with inappropriate or profane tags? And this is actually probably one of the biggest critiques of crowdsourcing projects I've seen is the fear that inappropriate tags would be added. When we looked at the Adler's data from our project set, less than 0.1% of the tags added had any form of profanity or inappropriate tags to them. Something about using the Zooniverse platform that was really helpful for us is that the biggest thing we saw was not within the tagging data, but within the chat. I was like, I lost the word. The ability to have like the chat room functionality in Zooniverse. We occasionally had 2 instances of inappropriate behavior where a volunteer had added or kind of attacked other volunteers for what they were commenting. And immediately Zooniverse allows other users to report that behavior. In both cases, the people who were doing this kind of inappropriate bullying were evicted from the Zooniverse platform and their IP addresses were blocked from being able to create a new user ID. But we found that it was very much not really an issue. But of course, that is also partially why you want to have a qualitative assurance or qualitative control process. I would say profanity was kind of the least of the issues we saw. We saw more coming in where people were tagging in their native languages. So we had a lot of tags added in German, French. Some were unsupported languages like Russian, where the characters were different. That was something we just were not prepared for and had not considered ahead of time, and it became a part of our quality assurance project.
I see a question before that from Jessica Davis. Did you find different types of data had different types of tagging needs?
So we actually did in the project, I added 3 different collections types. So we had rare book illustrations, archival photographs, and then object collection kind of surrogates or photographs. What we saw across the 3 collection types was the tags added from kind of a quantitative standpoint were equal. So across the 3 different collections, people still engaged with them equally, which was kind of surprising to us. We thought that there might be some, more interest in the photographs, more complications with the rare book illustrations, and that ended up not really being the case. But we did see that people actually, because of the workflow that I created, we had 2 different workflows. One engaged with the AI tags, one did not. The one that engaged with the AI tags was consistently completed at a much higher rate than that of the one that did not include AI tags, which kind of clued our project team into the idea that AI tags are not perfect. And we had a lot of comments from people about how they disliked how the AI was not as smart as they wished it was. But it clearly was a draw to the project and was really a conversation starter for a lot of the users.
Right. Next question, you have a bunch. Is this project far enough along that you can comment on the effect of added tags on improvements in discovery?
So the project is complete. What I will say is it's difficult to gauge improvements in discovery. I am no longer with the Adler Planetarium, so I am not sure how they will actually incorporate this data into their collections kind of catalog. When I was there, the initial plan had been to add them as keywords, and there was a breakdown in the kind of QA stage of making them either hyperlinked that could then be kind of used for browsability function or just being a part of the backend data. But I do not know where they are in that process at this moment. So my apologies, I can't answer that much better.
No, that's a really good tie-in actually to the next question, which is, can you talk about issues with accuracy from crowdsourced tags? I noticed the archival photo was tagged meteorite and meteor and moon rock, and it can't be all of those things.
Well, so that's actually something we had to discuss at the Adler. It could be all those things. And that was something very different. And it's something that we had to discuss from a curatorial standpoint as well as a cataloger standpoint, that what we were doing was looking into discussing our qualitative assurance process. We called it a QA for wrongness. So unless a tag was irrevocably wrong, like people tagged images of Chicago with New York because they saw a skyline, they added New York. People are trying to guess the years of archival photographs, they might have been wrong. So in some of those cases, if it was clearly wrong, then it was removed from the data. If it was not actually wrong, and it maybe was just different syntax, or in a certain sense, a little bit, maybe meteor versus meteorite, in some cases, we don't actually know, because some of the archival photographs had no more information than what you saw on kind of that left side of the screen. And so some of those we couldn't really make authoritative guesses. So a lot of what we saw was less about, meteorite, meteor, or moon rock. And what we were seeing was people were trying to tag relationships. So they would see a group image and tag it as a family. But the Adler can't confirm if that's a family or if it was just a group of people who were there together. But we wanted to kind of have that discussion that we didn't want to remove family because we don't know if that's inaccurate. But again, that then plays into how we're going to structure these systems. So from the Adler perspective, what was the conversation, and I don't know where they went with this from there, was that some of these could be added in the back end. So they were searchable, but they would not present on the front end of the online public access portal. So what that means is if somebody was looking for images of family, a photo could pop up, but when you look in the metadata, it didn't actually say family on that screen. So it helps return more results for things we weren't certain about, but it doesn't necessarily add it into the places where we're making an authoritative stance on that, if that kind of makes sense. It's a little bit tricky, and it's definitely something I would say is the complication to any kind of metadata project. And that's one of the things the Adler really had to look at, is this project produced over 400,000 metadata tags for 1,000 objects. So if you think about 400 metadata tags were added per image, that is a lot of data. And something we had to discuss was trying not to clog down search functionality. So if you add 400 in, and a lot of them were kind of thematic things, like we got a lot of tags for things being astronomy, astrology, history, things like that. If somebody tags that, throws that into the search bar and now receives 400 to 2,000 results, it gets very difficult to kind of bog into that. It can also slow your system down. So I just want to be very transparent that this is not a solved issue, and it is one to be aware of when taking on projects like this. That really needs to be thought of in kind of how you're going to use the data afterwards.
Great. Let's see if we can get through the next two questions in 1 minute.
Oh, yeah.
How do you incentivize participation in your crowdsourcing process?
So that was part of it, was using the Zooniverse platform. The Zooniverse platform already has 2 million registered volunteers. So putting the project on there, you kind of had a built-in participation. Besides that, we ran this during the time of COVID closure at the Adler. So it was sent out as part of our email blast, as well as our social media campaigns. And then it was picked up in news sources like the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune as things that people could engage with the museum during COVID closures. And we found that those were all very kind of good ways to engage with the public and bring in not only kind of a museum public, but also a crowdsourcing public.
All right, last one, squeeze it in. All right, what does QA look like as far as the demand on resource allocation? For example, percent of time needed to dedicate to these efforts?
Yes. So that is actually probably one of the biggest things I would caution anybody undertaking a project like this. They take massive amount of time, and that's why I like to make the distinction. These projects are not outsourcing your labor. They're creating more labor for your teams. It's just got to be seen in a different way. So instead of just seeing it as cataloging work, it now becomes part of your public programs. It becomes part of your engagement initiatives. And if you think about it that way, and you can bring project teams in besides just your cataloging staff, you can actually make that work. But I would say we found to create the project, it took me about 2,000 hours. So it took about a year to build this project. It took about a year to process the data. And then in the QA process, we found that it took probably anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes per object. So when you're talking about 1,000 objects, that's quite a lot of time. So this was something I think the Adler struggled with, and I think most institutions will struggle with, because it's not the, for lack of a better word, it's not the sexy part of the project to have people working on the QA to be doing these kinds of things where you're trying to, take 50 to 60 responses and condense them down into information. So all of that kind of technical stuff, as well as the actual QA process, was very time intensive. And that was why we kind of made the argument it needed to be thought of as a larger project, not just outsourcing of catalog kind of work, because that will never save you time and money. It's going to cost you more time. It's going to cost you more money to run these projects. So you need to think of them in a different way.
Okay, thank you so very much. This was fabulous. And we'll go on to our next presentation. Thank you again.